Durbin.
Thank you. Mr. Rosen, are you aware, on the same topic, that 80% of the people who die from drug overdoses started with opioid pills? It's those who die from heroin and fentanyl start with opioid pills?
I have seen public information to that effect, so with that qualification.
I think it's pretty well accepted. So do you have any idea how many opioid pills are produced legally by the pharmaceutical industry in the United States each year?
I don't have those numbers available, and obviously there are pharmaceuticals that can be used appropriately and pharmaceuticals that can be abused.
So let me tell you the number. 13 billion. 13 billion opioid pills a year produced in the United States and sold in commerce. 13 billion pills is enough for every adult in America to have a 3-week prescription of opioids. 13 billion. Next question. Do you know what agency gives the pharmaceutical industry the permission to produce 13 billion a year?
I'm not sure if I'm following the question, whether you're asking in terms of the controlled substances at DEA or if you mean more generally from
I'm talking about
FDA.
opioid pills. Oh. Opioid pills in America. What agency gives the industry the permission to produce 13 billion, enough for every adult in this country to have 3 weeks worth of opioid pills?
As I sit here, I don't know the answer to that. I could conjecture it rolls for multiple agencies like FDA, but I don't know the answer to that.
It's one agency. And in the flow chart, it's an agency that will be under your jurisdiction, the Drug Enforcement Administration. Fancy that the agency that's supposed to be protecting us in this drug crisis actually gives legal permission for the pharmaceutical industry to produce 13 billion opioid pills a year. I know that because I complained 4 years ago when it was 14 billion. I thought it was an outrage. And the DEA has lowered it to 13 billion. So you said that if you're going to solve a problem, you first have to define it. Let me define the problem. The problem is the Drug Enforcement Administration that is not paying attention to what is happening in America today. What are you going to do about it?
Well, the first step is to make sure I have good information. And I'm not sure that the information you just said is exactly right, so I will have to check that.
I'll stand by it, because I've I've raised this before this committee over and over and over again. I brought in the DEA. They couldn't explain it. How do you possibly explain the fact that we're in the midst of the worst drug crisis in the history of the United States, and the Drug Enforcement Administration, which you will be responsible for, is giving the green light for this massive production of opioid pills? I always add the caution, there are seriously ill people in pain who need it. But another agency of our federal government, the CDC, has sent out a warning to every doctor in America and said, except under the most extraordinary circumstances, never, ever prescribe more than 3 days worth of opioids because it leads to addiction. 3 days. 13 billion pills, 3 weeks for every adult in America. So we can lament more opioid deaths and car accidents, but what are we going to do about it? What is the Drug Enforcement Administration going to do about it? Do you have the courage to stand up to the pharmaceutical industry and say, enough? Your profits are not worth what it's doing to America. Will you do that?
Well, Senator, as I alluded to before, I will always proceed on the facts and the law. So if my judgment is that something needs to be done at the Drug Enforcement Administration, it won't be an issue of courage. It'll be an issue of making sure I have the correct information and I'm taking the right steps.
It's going to take some courage, too, because obviously people who've gone before you couldn't bring themselves to do this. I want to talk about the Hudson Institute again, which was raised by Senator Lee. The reason we both raised it is that we were the original authors of criminal sentencing reform. Did it together on a bipartisan basis, joined by Senator Grassley, who's an invaluable ally, Senator Booker and others. We got it done, and as you mentioned, 2 different parties, 2 different branches of government, we did something significant. And I think that's important. I'm glad we were part of it. Along comes this Hudson Institute. Now, this is a think tank that has a point of view. And back when we first started the Lee and Durbin enterprise here, they published an article entitled, "Why Trump Should Oppose Criminal Justice Reform." This is the same agency that's now been chosen by the Department of Justice and Trump administration to be part of this so-called independent review system. I join with Senator Lee. I'm a little bit worried that we just let a fox in a chicken coop here. And what troubles me as much, if not more, is that after it was signed into law, the Hudson Institute published an article and said, we don't think you're giving enough time to this independent review commission to do its work. 6 months may not be enough. So they've really bought into delay even before they've been given this assignment. What can we trust that you will do to make sure that this moves in a timely fashion to achieve the goals which the president signed into law on December 22nd last year?
Well, I think I addressed that earlier. That
I want you to address it again because it's important.
Sure. I'll say again that I understood how important the objectives are. I also understood that regardless of where people stood before it was enacted, it's the law. And so if I'm confirmed, if I were to join a law enforcement organization, I'm a big believer in complying with the law. That's not to say that problems aren't complex. I'm not trying to minimize administrative things, budget issues. There can be lots of complexities. I'm not trying to minimize any of that. But my objective, if I was confirmed, would be to implement the law in the way Congress set it out.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.